very much. It's very nice to be here. Thank you, Mr. Kolikov, for inviting me. I want to try and answer the question raised by Mr. Andrei Kepa when he said that what we need is a greater respect. In the policies we articulate, we need to show a greater respect for nature. And I want to ask a historical question having to do with what he said, which is, how and when did we lose that respect? And not just lose it as individuals, but in a systematic way in public policy and in our social outlook. So what I want to ask is the question, how and when? It's a historical question, and in a way it's a genealogical question. How and when did we transform the concept of nature into the concept of natural resources? When did that happen, and how did that happen? Because if we can give an answer to that question, we would begin to understand when we lost respect and what we might do to gain it, regain it in our attitudes towards nature, along the policies that we adopt. Now, it is true that the policies that the minister said and earlier speakers said, we've got standard ways of thinking about it, such as we want to disincentivize pollution and we want to incentivize conservation. And this can be done by taxes, this can be done by creating companies with employment and with subsidies for conservation. These are standard things. You have cap and trade, you have more radical policies like taxation. But what I want to ask is the underlying question, which is, why is it that we got into a situation where we have to incentivize or incentivize conservation or disincentivize pollution and so on? So, you see, I think that you can't ask the question about nature just as an isolated question. Questions of the environment and questions of ecology are caught up with larger questions. So the most general question we can ask is, how and when did we transform the concept of the world as not merely a place to live in, but as a place to master and control? How did that happen? The question about nature is just a specific version of that question, and there are other related questions as well, such as, how and when did we transform the concept of human beings into the concept of citizens? How and when did we transform the concept of people into the concept of populations? How and when did we transform the concept of knowledge into the concept of expertise? These are all related questions, and they all form part of an outlook that emerged at a very specific time. And a Russian historian, an historian of science and culture, was one of the most brilliant figures who tried to grapple with this, a historian and philosopher called Boris Hessen, whom I urge you all to read, because he made remarkable contributions to understanding the relation between science and culture and society. And his main diagnosis was that sometime in the 17th century, we began to think of nature, we began to define nature in a way that it had never been defined before. And that is, we defined nature as that which the natural sciences study. We began to believe for the first time that there is nothing in nature, no properties in nature, that cannot be studied by natural science. That nobody believed that until the 17th century. And as Boris Hessen and other philosophers have pointed out, other historians have pointed out, sometime in the 17th century, it became very important for historians, philosophers, scientists, and so on to begin to think of nature as only containing what the natural sciences study. What this meant was that you desacralize nature. That is, for centuries people believed that nature was shot through, was replete with sacral properties. When Newton said that nature is completely brute and material and matter is completely inert, he put God outside the universe, and motion came as a result of an external push from God which set matter and the universe in motion. Earlier times, in popular Christianity, in many other pagan philosophies and so on, motion came from an inner source of dynamism which was divine, inside of nature. So the great transformation in the 17th century was that nature got desacralized because it was seen as brute and material, purely material and inert, and God was given a providential position outside of the universe. This desacralized nature, and it was done very deliberately. It was not as if this was just a matter of science. It was done because alliances were formed all over Europe around the Newton, and in Britain it was through the Royal Society, in which people in the Royal Society and these institutions around the new science were not just scientists. They were making alliances, worldly alliances, with commercial interests and with Orthodox Protestant interests in order to create a certain kind of political economy which was extractive from nature, which was predatory towards nature, and had no other goal but to take from nature with impunity for profit. This was an explicit goal of why it is that science and commercial interests must come together. And for that reason, it was important to convert nature into the concept of natural resources. And that was the beginning of the transformation that I was pointing to at the beginning. Now, what's important here is that maybe today many of us cannot believe in a sacralized nature. Maybe we cannot. I mean, there are many people today who do not have such an understanding of nature. It's part of our modernity that maybe we don't believe in the sacred. I'm not saying you shouldn't believe in the sacred, but it's just a fact that many people in many parts of the world do not believe in the sacred. Does that mean that we cannot have the kind of respect that existed for nature prior to the predatory, extractive political economies that developed around modernity in the late 17th and early 18th century? Well, I think that is completely unnecessary, because I think it is a superstition. It is a superstition of modernity to say that there is nothing in nature that the natural sciences cannot study. That's a superstition of modernity. Because even if you don't believe in anything sacred, you can still believe that nature contains intrinsic value. And natural sciences do not study value. Right out there, in that river, there is a natural scientific property which is H2O. But in that river, there's also intrinsic value. And natural sciences don't study value. So it's a superstition of modernity to claim that there's nothing in that river except H2O and other properties that natural sciences study. And part of the respect for nature is to see in natural science, is to see in nature much more than what the natural sciences study, including value properties. And why is it important to see that value properties are intrinsic to things? Because the whole philosophy of utility, of taking from nature for our utilitarian gain, is because we do not think that things have intrinsic value. Because there's nothing there which natural sciences can't study. You see, if you think value is not intrinsic to things, inside things, basically a property within things, if you think value is some free-floating thing, then your idea will be that the next thing that comes along which has more value, you should go for that and destroy what is already there. Right? It's only if you think that what is already there already contains intrinsic value that you will not plan for obsolescence, for getting for the new thing that has more of it because it's free-floating. But if it's intrinsic to it, you cannot have that attitude of utilitarianism to it. So yesterday you heard, and today we heard in much of the discussion that there is such a thing as taking economic policies which will promote a better ecology. Of course you can do that, but we ought to ask what is the thinking behind the standard, what they call homo economicus, the rationality that is considered to be part of what it is to think along economic lines. See, I'm sorry to say there are many economists here, but I'm afraid that discipline has become a fraud. There's something extraordinary. No other discipline is like economics. In economics, there are theories which have been shown to be false for 40, 50 years at least, and people still say them. They say them in sophisticated models with quantitative analysis, but we know those theories to be false. If anybody in physics made claims which have been false for 50 years, they would be a laughing stock. In economics, they get a Nobel Prize. And part of the trouble is that there is a conception of rationality which has dictated a lot of the economics profession and a lot of its thinking. And one of its claims is that one of its outlooks has rationality understood in extremely individualistic terms. So you have arguments like the tragedy of the commons arguments, which says that it is irrational to cooperate in the commons because to cooperate in the commons would lead to your paying a cost which you never know that others will pay. And so it would be better for you from a rational point of view to be a free rider or to not pay the cost. Pollution is a very good example. So if I don't know that everybody else is going to pay the cost and restrain themselves, say in a matter of overfishing, to restrain themselves from fishing or something because there's so much overfishing. If I don't know that others are going to do it, why should I do it? And because the costs of doing it are, the costs of cooperation are much greater than the costs of non-cooperation for me as an individual, so why should I cooperate? And so that leads to the tragedy of the commons. Now, what one needs, and this is the same kind of outlook that Andrzej Klepacz was talking about when he talked about respect, what one needs is just simply to say, I reject that way of thinking. That is, you cannot think of economics and the economic outlook along these lines because the question you should assume is, the point you should assume is that if I pay my cost, others will pay my cost, pay the cost. That's what it is to live in a society which is unalienated, which is ethical, in which each individual thinks from the point of view of everyone's interests. And I think let me give you an example. Let me end with an example. You see, think of what happens. I was teaching my daughter to drive a car, and she was sitting next to me, and I was at the wheel, and I was telling her about the car and so on, and then I would look at her, and my body as an individual would be looking at her. And then I would turn around and drive the car, and my orientation to the world was not of an individual looking at her, but my orientation when I was driving was from the point of view of the car. If I looked at the road from the point of view of my own body, I would crash the car. So when you're driving, you look at the road, the whole orientation toward the world is from something larger, from the point of view of something larger than the individual, which is the point of view of the car. Now we need a social version of that perspective. Right? What we need to substitute for the car is looking at the world, orienting ourselves to the world from the point of view not just of oneself and one's body or one's interests, but from the point of view of a larger point of view. And that, I think, is part of the outlook which does not see nature as natural resources, does not see people as populations, and does not see knowledge merely as expertise. Thank you very much.